Oh yes, Dearborn, Michigan. There's a lot to go over in this video, including what kind of experience you can expect when you visit the city today. Of course, there's all the stuff associated with Henry Ford and the Blue Oval, plus there's the fact that Dearborn recently became the first Arab-majority city in the US. We'll get into all of that and more in this video. Downtown Dearborn is 15 miles southwest from downtown Detroit. Bordering Dearborn for a large portion is Detroit. For another large portion, it's Dearborn Heights, and then to the southeast, it's Allen Park and Melvindale. It's a big town if you couldn't tell. It has several main routes that serve it, including Telegraph, Ford Road, Michigan Avenue, I-94, and the Southfield Freeway, among other roads. Let's start with someone who knows Dearborn better than I do, shall we? Meet Nick Wisniewski.
I'm somewhat of an expert, I'd like to say. If there's one thing I'm probably worth in this entire world, is I can get you around Dearborn.
Well, I know Nick from a long time ago, back in 2017. He was actually my instructor. He taught me how to edit video at Specs Howard School of Media Arts. So now let's talk about Dearborn. This is not a good town at all. There's nothing to do here. There's not any kind of museum here that appeals to people from a national standpoint.
No diverse food.
No diverse food. There's not like a famous inventor that invented something here that, now there's like a top 10 Fortune 500 company headquartered here. There's nothing like that here. Why does this place suck so bad, Nick?
Obviously, a bit of sarcasm there. This town, I love it here. Again, full disclosure, I work here, so it's going to be that aspect of things for me. But if I didn't work here, I would still love to live here because there is so much to do. Because it is so different, so unique.
There's actually two downtown Dearborns, if you will. It's kind of unique in that way. There's West Dearborn and East Dearborn. Michigan Avenue serves as the main street for both, and currently we're in West Dearborn. But as you can tell, Dearborn isn't shy of having a variety of restaurant options, so many that it rivals downtown Detroit. Both East and West Dearborn are full of coffee shops, Italian, Indian, Mexican, Lebanese, Mediterranean, and of course, Dearborn has several American options as well. I'm just walking up and down Michigan Avenue right now here in West Dearborn, and you just can't help but notice how many restaurants there are.
Even if you're not walking, the ability to pull up to a store and park is always nice. And then if you're in a big city, that's not always going to be the case. That's not always going to be a thing. And especially that's why I was mentioning I love Dearborn. I love especially the west downtown. It's really easy to go and park, jump out, and go do your thing.
And Dearborn you don't have to pay to park.
Don't have to pay to park here.
You heard that right. Free parking in downtown West Dearborn, not just on Sundays either. Southeast Michigan has a lot of nice downtown areas to check out, along with downtown Detroit, of course, but hardly any of these downtown areas offer free parking. Safe to say that Dearborn might offer more with their free downtown parking than any of the other downtowns in this area. That being said, Dearborn is a largely underrated destination in the area as far as having a night out on the town goes, although that might not be the case for much longer as more and more people in the area find out about what's been going on here. For example, you could get a $200 steak dinner, or you could spend $12 for fish and chips right next door. You could get a taste of Lebanese, or you could go for Italian. Plenty of pizza options here too if that's your thing, or if you're a part of the cult following that is the Detroit Coney Dog, you can find that here too. Pretty much any kind of food that you would be looking for on a night out is located right here in West Dearborn, all for free parking too, whereas you pay by the hour in other popular nightlife spots such as downtown Detroit, Royal Oak, or Birmingham. Well, West Dearborn wasn't always as vibrant as it is today. A Detroit Free Press article from 2016 says how West Dearborn had several curiously vacant storefronts in the years leading up to 2016. Vacancy rates reportedly were at their highest in 2015 at 38%. Today, there's hardly any vacant storefronts, as the rate is at 4%, in which the city hides that 4% pretty nicely. This, by the way, is the Bryant Branch Library. It sits on land that was donated by Mrs. Henry Ford in 1923. Construction was approved by Dearborn Township voters shortly after, and the land was transferred from Dearborn Township to the city of Dearborn in 1928. It served as the main library for Dearborn until 1969, when the Henry Ford Centennial Library was then built, which is located off of Michigan Avenue, and it's closer to downtown East Dearborn than it is to West Dearborn. Back to the talking point as Nick illustrates further to what has changed in West Dearborn over the years.
That used to be just a parking lot. The parking lot for this. There's food there, there's bars there, there's an ice cream place, so like you get your food, you get your drink, you can just sit outside.
And a lot of these communities have the bones to like build something like this, but they don't even try.
Exactly right.
Speaking of walkable downtowns, that's been a main focus of investment for a somewhat large company in town. I'm trying to remember the name. What is that company's name? My goodness, I forget. Oh man, and you have to be kidding me. How could it slip my mind now? Is it General Motors? No, it's not that one. Is it Chrysler? I'm sorry, I mean Stellantis? No, it's not that one either. It's Ford. That's right. Goodness, how could I forget? Ford. Yeah, so anyway, speaking of walkable downtowns, everyone in the state of Michigan, besides me, knows right away that Ford is headquartered in Dearborn, and they know how Ford spent $90 million to buy out the long decaying and abandoned Michigan Central train station in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood. That was a big topic of discussion for a couple of years. Ford also spent an extra $950 million to renovate the structure to turn it into their new technology and cultural hub. But not everyone knows that Ford has also been investing millions of dollars in the hometown of its founding father. What up, Henry Ford? One of the larger renewal projects came in 2017 when Ford tore down some buildings and renovated a few others in a 2-block area to create Wagner Place. I passed the spot earlier, but I'll go ahead and show it again. The reasoning behind the move, as stated by Ford, was how creating a walkable downtown can help improve the quality of life for their employees and for the Dearborn community. Wagner Place is a 150,000 square foot mixed-use development with retail on the street level and office space on the floors above, being the workplace for as many as 600 Ford employees. The name Wagner Place comes from the historic Wagner Hotel, which first opened in 1896. Ford, of course, kept the facade in place while transforming it into office and conference space. The move ended up being a success, as today, there are no vacancies in all of Wagner Place. On the subject of Ford, the massive auto company seems to be moving their main headquarters building to a spot that's not far from Wagner Place, as there's new construction going on along Oakwood Boulevard. The company hasn't admitted as such. Instead, they're calling it their Research and Engineering Center. The new building takes place of a parking lot on the side of Ford's Product and Development Center, which has been there since 1953. The new building is expected to be completed in 2025, and the company plans to relocate 6,000 employees to the new building. It goes along with Ford's new theme of operating in a walkable downtown, as this new building is supposed to be a large, walkable campus where employees can head from one building to another and enjoy different amenities within the campus. On that note, thousands of Ford employees used to work in a suburban-style office building that was 2 miles northeast of here. In 2022, Ford sold the Regent Court office building to a local real estate developer. The building was 670,000 square feet, and it was where thousands of Ford employees once worked, but that's not the case anymore. As you can see, the developer recently tore down the building, and the developer plans to build townhomes in its place. And these towers are just south of the Regent Court site. One mile south across acres of neatly mowed green lawns and parking lots is the official Ford World headquarters. For now. The building is an iconic one in the area, standing 200 feet tall, and can be seen by tens of thousands who drive the Southfield Freeway daily. The building was completed in 1956. That being said, this is complete speculation on my part. Nothing that I could find suggested that Ford had plans to move out of this building, but I have a hard time seeing the current Ford World Headquarters building still being the Ford World Headquarters building 10 years from now. With Ford's more than ever present commitment to transitioning to having offices in trendy, walkable downtown areas, the current Ford World Headquarters building doesn't fit in with that vision, with it being a standalone suburban office tower that's surrounded by massive parking lots and large green lawns that extend forever, also surrounded by 4-lane Michigan left corridors and freeways, So yeah, once again, the type of office setting that Ford is trying to transition most of their employees in the area to is one that's in a walkable community or a walkable downtown, and obviously, the old Ford World Headquarters building ain't that. So for those reasons, I wouldn't be surprised if Ford eventually moves on from this building, as they've shown that they're not hesitant to do with some of their other long-owned buildings. It wouldn't surprise me at all. Once again, complete, pure speculation, but it's very well thought out speculation at that. Another company with headquarters in Dearborn that I don't speculate will be moving office buildings in the near future would be Carhartt. That's right, lying in the shadows of the big bad Ford Motor Company is the headquarters for Carhartt. Dearborn is like a hilljack's paradise, with not only Ford being headquartered in Dearborn, but also the ultimate hilljack brand, Carhartt, is headquartered here. All jokes aside, Carhartt being headquartered here is often forgotten about, with Ford taking up most of the corporate fame and glory in Dearborn. Remember, Henry Ford is to Michigan what George Washington is to D.C. Or maybe it would be more relatable to my audience if I said how Abraham Lincoln is to Illinois. Only people who have lived in the area for an extended period of time would know what I mean. Especially in Dearborn, though. Go anywhere in the city and everything is named Ford this, Ford that. You know, Henry Ford Elementary, Henry Ford Academy, Edsel Ford High School, Ford Memorial United Methodist Church, Ford Patio Bar and Grill, Ford's Garage, Henry Ford Medical Center. The list goes on and on. What you don't see anywhere is Carhartt Elementary or Carhartt High School, etc., etc. Well, Carhartt employs over 700 across their 3 Dearborn facilities, with an announcement of 125 high-paying jobs being added back in December of 22. The move came in response to Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer announcing that Carhartt had been approved for a nearly $1 million performance-based grant from the Michigan Business Development Program. Carhartt admitted that if it wasn't for that grant, that the company likely would have added those jobs at its Kentucky distribution center in Mexico, or the company would have just made the jobs fully remote. This is Carhartt's corporate office building, and behind it are 2 larger warehouses. Carhartt was founded by Hamilton Carhartt in 1889 in Detroit. There was a large factory off of Michigan Avenue in Corktown. And just like Ford, amazingly today, Carhartt is still ran by the descendants of the original founder. Hamilton Carhartt was born in New York, but he grew up in southeast Michigan. Initially, Carhartt ran a furnishing business, which in return inspired him to create his own products. From the very start, Carhartt identified the strong demand for rough and tough blue-collar clothing. Carhartt started out his brand with 2 sewing machines and 5 employees. With the industrial boom occurring right after Carhartt established his business, Carhartt saw massive success with its tough, rugged, and durable clothing. That success obviously has continued throughout this day, with the brand being the go-to for many hardworking men and women across the world. Not just that, but for some time now, people will wear Carhartt clothing just for style. Lastly, you couldn't be a businessman in the Detroit area in the late 1800s or early 1900s if you didn't have your own automobile company. It's like a hilljack on an organic diet. Something just wasn't quite right there. Well, safe to assume that most people don't know that Carhartt was once a car company, and it was founded by the same guy who started the Carhartt clothing brand. Early on, only the wealthiest of people could afford a car. That was until Henry Ford invented the Model T and had great success with it while combining it with the assembly line. Anyway, Carhartt was a big fan of automobiles before Henry Ford invented his Model T. Carhartt owned a 1904 Packard Model L, which ran on a 4-cylinder 22-horsepower engine with a 94-inch wheelbase. So in April of 1910, Carhartt established the Carhartt Automobile Corporation in upstate New York. He was the president, and his son, Hamilton Carhartt Jr., was the vice president and general manager. Despite being based out of New York, his cars were put together in Detroit at Jefferson Avenue in Baldwin, which is just east of the Belle Isle Bridge. The company had an interesting yet very short run after ending production in 1912. With $20,000 in liabilities at the time, yet only $4,000 in the company's bank account, Carhartt decided to end his dreams of becoming the next automotive entrepreneur and focus solely on his clothing brand. Only 500 Carhartt cars were ever built, and none are known to still exist today. More on Carhartt automobiles and other auto history can be found in the Automotive Hall of Fame, which is, of course, in Dearborn. Often forgotten about is the Automotive Hall of Fame in the middle of all these other things to go do and see in the middle of this Henry Ford Greenfield Village Museum complex. But yeah, here it is, the Automotive Hall of Fame. The Automotive Hall of Fame was established in 1939 in New York City. It went through various name changes that nobody really cares about before relocating to Washington, D.C. in 1960. In 1971, it moved to Midland, Michigan, of all places, before settling down in Dearborn in 1997. Hard to argue that there isn't a better location for it, being right in the middle of a region that celebrates automotive heritage like New Orleans does for Mardi Gras. The Automotive Hall of Fame is a more affordable option when compared to Greenfield Village, with tickets only being $8 for adults. Speaking of Greenfield Village, we're right next to it, and for some reason, its reputation seems to be on the line. I mean, I think it's fine, but I don't know. After hearing this story, you can tell me what you think.
Well, Greenfield Village has a lot of negative reviews. I don't know if you knew this, but Greenfield Village has quite a few negative reviews on Google, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Surprising.
Well-spread traveler Konstantin Marcos.
What up, Konstantin Marcos?
Sounds legit.
Was driving around for an hour and a half, and he couldn't find the entrance to Greenfield Village. So he had to settle elsewhere to watch the Ford fireworks show. Because he was sent to a doctor's office, he gives Greenfield Village a 1 star out of 5. Otherwise, Greenfield Village has a 4.8 out of 5 based off of 5,000 reviews. So as long as you don't get sent to a doctor's office, it sounds like you'll have a good time.
Pretty amazing, right? Well, I mean, my other thought there is, I don't know if anybody watching this has been to the Village before, but you could drive around Dearborn for an hour. You're gonna find the entrance. It is not tough to miss. Well, literally can miss it, I guess.
Konstantin Marcos can miss it.
He missed it. That individual missed it. And missed out on a good time too, apparently.
Hey, yo, Konstantin. I found it. It's, right there. That's the intersection of Oakwood and Village Road. And you can see the sign right there. There's also an exit for it off of the Southfield Freeway on the east side of the complex. The Henry Ford Museum Complex, to be more specific. Well, here, there's the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation and there's Greenfield Village. Combined, they form what is the largest indoor-outdoor museum complex in the U.S. 1.7 million visitors swing by annually, with 37% coming from out of state. The tourism brings hundreds of millions of dollars to the local economy. Inside has the Rosa Parks bus, the Wright brothers' home and workshop, George Washington's camp bed, the chair that Lincoln sat on in the Ford Theater while he was being assassinated, and many other random interesting finds. More on how the museum was founded in a bit, because also in the museum complex is the Henry Ford Academy, which is a charter school, and it was the first school to be developed jointly by a global corporation, public education, and a major nonprofit cultural institution. The academy was established in 1929, which is the same year that the Henry Ford Museum was established. The school closed in 1969 before reopening in 1997. Alright, so as I was mentioning earlier how the Henry Ford Museum has a lot of random yet very historically significant objects inside, you might be wondering why. Why are there so many random yet historically relevant things at a museum in Dearborn, Michigan of all places? Well, you can thank the man himself, Henry Ford. He basically dug his heel in the ground and told everybody what was going to happen, and if they didn't like it, then tough luck. They could beat it because Henry Ford knew what he wanted to build and he knew what type of history needed to be displayed. And what I love the most about this quote is how he finishes it, saying how this isn't gonna be bunk. Love it. In the early 1900s, Henry Ford was basically today's Bill Gates. You know, he was today's Jeff Bezos. Henry Ford was known worldwide for his invention of the Model T and his major contributions to the assembly line. It was an act that truly changed society across the world, sort of like how computers and the internet did in the 80s. As I mentioned earlier, when the assembly line was first implemented with cars, it allowed cars to be mass-produced. Before that, cars took a very long time to get built. Craftsmen would build each car by hand in a shop. The Model T's mass production allowed the average American household to own a car, whereas before, you had to be incredibly wealthy to have one. The assembly line not only allowed for more production of cars, but cars were much, much cheaper to build once the assembly line became mainstream. Labor costs went down as well, and in the end, a consistent product was being built. While all of that success made Henry Ford and his family incredibly wealthy, back when all of this was going on in the early 1900s, Dearborn was more of a rural community and it looked nothing like it does today. Both Ford and his wife, Clara, grew up in rural settings despite living their adult lives by doing business in the city. Henry Ford in particular grew up in a farmhouse that was located near Ford and Greenfield roads. Today, the two make for a really busy intersection and it's surrounded by urban developments, although there's a historical marker on the southeast side of the intersection to remind everyone that that's where Henry Ford grew up. Here's an aerial photo of the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village in 1949. In the center, you can see the word Ford in the grass, and you can see some leftover airstrips in the center of what was then the Dearborn Proving Grounds. It was called the Ford Airport, which was short-lived, only from 1924 to 1947. Shaded in is the location of the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village. Northeast of the complex, you can still see that there were some farm fields in the area. In 1919, there was a road improvement project in Springwells Township where Henry Ford's childhood home was. The plans called for the home to either be moved 200 yards from its original location or to be torn down altogether. Ford ended up buying the house and he restored it himself to make every last detail of it resemble what he remembered it being when he grew up. In 1944, Ford moved it to Greenfield Village, where it still sits on display for visitors today. That was just the start of it all, as it wasn't the only building that Henry Ford brought to Greenfield Village. Restoring his mother's home inspired him to purchase other buildings and lay out what we know today as Greenfield Village on property that was already owned by Ford. Once his mind was set on it, Ford then went around the country and found random buildings that he thought would help complete his new Greenfield Village. Buildings like Hank's Silk Mill from Mansfield, Connecticut, a pottery shop from a South Carolina plantation, the Tripp Sawmill from Tipton, Michigan, a cider mill from nearby Plymouth, Michigan. That's only a few of the buildings because there were other buildings from all over the eastern half of the country, including one from Cape Cod. Additionally, Henry Ford was friends with Thomas Edison. As a result, the village has many of Edison's Menlo Park buildings. Not just that, but Ford also collected many of Edison's possessions over the years, and many of those items are on display in the Henry Ford Museum. Ford had a passion for collecting items that were a part of American society from the pre-industrial and post-industrial era. In return, Ford built this large indoor-outdoor museum complex to show the world everything that he had collected. Of course, items and other buildings have continued to be added to the museum long after Henry Ford had passed.
There's a group of people, a large group of people, usually retirees, that'll get the membership to the village, and you'll see them, they just get it so they can walk every morning. Right, because used to be old people would walk at the mall. These folks get a membership to the village and they walk through the village. Like that's so much better than walking through the mall. Right?
You get the vitamin D with the sun.
And then there's always something pretty to look at. You got some horses, you got the train. Everything's great.
Outside of Greenfield Village, there's another Henry Ford attraction, that being the Fairlane home. Really, it's a stone's throw away from Greenfield Village, but you have to go around a roadblock or two to get there. If you walk, you can use a pedestrian path and go through the woods, so that way you don't fear for your life from drag racers on Michigan Avenue. Fairlane was the home for Clara and Henry Ford and was constructed between 1913 and 1915. They lived there until they passed away, Henry Ford in 1947, Clara Ford in 1950. It was built on 1,300 acres of farmland, not far from where either Clara or Henry grew up. There was also a dam that was constructed across the Rouge River, along with the powerhouse that supplied the estate with power. The leftover power generated from the dam would help supply Dearborn with energy. Today you can rent the Ford house for an event, or you can visit it when it's not being used for events. There's a private event going on at the Henry Ford house today, but they're kind enough to allow me to get this camera shot of the Ford house. On the other side of the street that I'm on right now is the University of Michigan Dearborn, or simply just U of M Dearborn. U of M Dearborn was initially called Dearborn Center, even though it's always been operated by the University of Michigan. Originally established in 1959, the school was yet again another gift from the Ford Motor Company. Ford donated 200 acres of land and $6.5 million in 1959 to establish the school. As Ford helped get the school rolling, it's only right that the first 3 programs at the school were industrial engineering, mechanical engineering, along with business administration. The name officially changed to U of M Dearborn in 1963, and it's been a thriving public school ever since. Just north of U of M Dearborn is Henry Ford College, which is a public community college that was established in 1938. Sharing space with Fordson High School, while students that attended Fordson Junior College technically were in 13th and 14th grade at the time. In 1946, the name changed to Dearborn Junior College. Separately, there was the Henry Ford Trade School, which was funded and operated by the Ford Motor Company. However, that school became defunct in 1952. When that happened, Henry Ford Trade School donated all of their remaining assets to Dearborn Junior College. As a result, the school renamed itself yet again, this time to Henry Ford Community College, and then in 2014, the name changed to its current name of Henry Ford College. So that's all good and dandy. The 2 colleges sit off of Evergreen Road between Michigan Avenue and Ford Road. On the other side of Evergreen from the colleges is the Fairlane Town Center, which of course gets its name from Clara and Henry Ford's estate. The Fairlane Town Center first opened on March 1, 1976. The mall hit its peak the following year, with 150 stores and services inside. Today, 98 of the 125 available storefronts are occupied. Over the years, the mall went through the typical phases of quickly rising followed by a long and slow decline, although when you go inside today, it doesn't at all resemble a dead mall. In 2017, Ford converted 240,000 square feet of unused retail space into modern offices, originally bringing along 1,800 employees, but that move was only temporary as a developer bought them in 2022. During the same year, AMC closed their movie theater at the mall. You can see that it was fairly busy at Fairlane on the day that I was here. Here's a 1967 aerial shot of the area before the mall was developed, with the Fairlane Mall being built here 10 years after the shot was taken. Fast forward 14 years to 1981, and at this point the mall is just about brand new. What's even cooler about this aerial shot is that you can see the original monorail that connected the shopping mall with Michigan's second largest hotel. The hotel was completed in 1976 and had 800 rooms, including a revolving restaurant on top. While the monorail was very short-lived, stopping service in 1988. And of course, like everything in this town seemingly, it was operated by Ford. Well, over the years, the hotel declined and was unable to keep up with code. In 2018, the city of Dearborn deemed the hotel to be unfit for human occupancy, and it was forced to shut down. For the last 6 years, it's been standing here vacant. Continuing on that note, one of the biggest struggles for the city of Dearborn over the recent times would be not only keeping vacancy rates from being too high at the Fairlane Town Center and dealing with this abandoned hotel here, but also there's other larger commercial properties in Dearborn that have faced some struggles. On the edge of West Dearborn, for example, is Garrison Place. And in August of 24, which is not too long before I uploaded this video to YouTube, a developer announced a $25 million redevelopment plan for the vacant shopping center. However, it's hard to know if those plans will go through at the moment, as the property has back taxes dating back to 2022, totaling up to be over $400,000. With that being the case, I wouldn't count on anything being developed there until there's possibly a new ownership group. Right next to Garrison Place is the abandoned Village Plaza Tower. The city of Dearborn issued a demolition notice back in 2022, but the tower still stands today. Back in 2018, the tower was evacuated due to water damage and asbestos. The Detroit Free Press article continues to say how a broken pipe caused damage to the building, forcing them to need to shut it down temporarily, but it seems like the temporary shutdown turned into a permanent shutdown. Seems like the ownership group had trouble keeping the building up to modern code over the years, and now after being abandoned for 6 years or so, it's probably going to get demolished. The only question is, when? What's not a question is that both Garrison Place and the Village Tower are prime real estate, and they're in a great location considering everything that's been going on in West Dearborn and considering that both are right off of Michigan Avenue. The sites definitely have the potential to blossom into something other than an eyesore for the city, so hopefully something can be done soon. Standing the test of time over all of those retail and commercial structures is the Ford Rouge plant. Located in the extreme southeast part of the city, far away from most of Dearborn's residents, is the long-time-running, iconic Rouge plant. Henry Ford begun to buy up property along the Rouge River back in 1915. When it was all said and done, he was able to accumulate up to 2,000 acres of what was mostly swampland. For a while, Ford didn't know what he was going to do with the land. According to the henryford.org, Ford considered turning it into a bird sanctuary at one point. Needless to say, that didn't happen. Instead, Franklin D. Roosevelt encouraged Ford to build boats for the U.S. Navy. And that he did. In 1917, the first structure was complete of what was eventually going to become the Ford Rouge complex. The first factory assembled what was called Eagle boats. But so much for that, because it turned out that the U.S. didn't need Ford's help, as the war ended before the Eagle boats were ever used in a battle. At this point, however, the Rouge River had already been dug into for large ships to be able to navigate the final few miles before its confluence with the Detroit River. So Ford then used the facility to bring in huge ships full of iron ore, coal, and limestone. To give that some more context, Ford was a control freak. He wanted to achieve total self-sufficiency by owning, operating, and coordinating all of the resources required to run his automobile production. Ford once owned nearly 1 million total acres of forest, limestone, and iron mines throughout northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Ford also owned coal mining operations in Kentucky, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. So Ford basically used his Rouge plant as a port of entry to bring in all of the resources that were mined from elsewhere across the country. The first non-boat vehicles that were manufactured at the Rouge plant were actually tractors. His Model T was already in full production at the Highland Park assembly plant, so he decided to expand his business and make tractors next. The Fordson was the world's first mass-produced tractor, giving Henry Ford yet another achievement on his resume. Also, the Rouge plant had a massive power plant. It was so big that it often gave out too much power. Some of it was used to power Henry Ford's Highland Park plant, while the rest was given to help supply the city of Detroit. The Rouge plant expanded quickly, with the glass plant being in full operation by 1923, producing better quality glass at a lower cost. In 1928, the Ford Model A became the first low-priced car to use laminated safety glass. Also by 1928, the Rouge complex had been completely built. The Great Depression was right around the corner, but Ford kept his operations going, only at a huge cost to the workers. Ford was always looking for ways to reduce operating expenses while keeping things going. On May 26, 1937, a group of union organizers tried to make a sales pitch, if you will, at the Rouge plant, but Ford security and what the henryford.org calls a group of thugs beat them severely. This became known as the Battle of Overpass, which was an important moment in history for the United Auto Workers Union. The Rouge continued to operate fully after Ford's passing in 1947. Starting in the 1960s, however, more awareness was being made of environmental concerns like, maybe how there should never be a river that lights on fire? Yeah, that's right. In 1969, the Rouge River set on fire a few miles downstream from the Ford Rouge complex. It happened when a construction worker dropped a torch on the river shortly after the Shell Oil Company spilled 3,000 gallons of oil into the Rouge. Yeah, that'll do it. With environmental concerns on top of Ford implementing a new strategy of decentralizing operations in order to combat the auto unions, production at the Rouge plant saw a long, slow, and steady decline over the years. Production got so low that in 1989, the Ford Motor Company sold all of the Rouge River frontage of their property to a company that was called Rouge Steel, along with 45% of the 2,000 acres. Today, the steel plant is operated by Cleveland Cliffs. The Ford portion of the site continued to see a loss in number of overall jobs, and by 1992, the Ford Mustang was the only car being assembled at the site. Ford was on track to eliminate production of the Mustang, but efforts made by union leaders saved the model and saved the Rouge plant. By 1997, the plant started to see a serious comeback. Ford agreed to modernize the facility, and today, the plant is running with around 6,000 employees, with yet another big-time renovation project currently in the works. Today, the plant assembles the Ford F-Series trucks and remains as Ford's largest industrial complex company-wide. That being said, let's look at some of the neighborhoods. While we're doing that, Nick shared with me why he chose to buy a home in Dearborn.
The neighborhoods and the homes is really the main reason why we moved here. I was working here part-time at the time. My wife and I were doing pretty good for ourselves. We could have lived almost anywhere. But we chose this town. She was just in love with the neighborhoods.
And you were working here.
Yeah. And we would drive through some of these neighborhoods and she was like, the neighborhoods are beautiful. Our house that we ended up buying, 2-story, red brick, built in 1939. And that's pretty much our entire neighborhood. Tons of bungalows and tons of, stuff, but just old homes with character on the inside. And that's what she loved. We started looking in our neighborhood, missed out on a couple of houses because it was just going so fast at the time. But we barely looked anywhere else other than this 1.1 mile square radius area.
Up ahead is Ford Homes, which is considered to be the first subdivision built in Dearborn. Between 1919 and 1920, Henry Ford and his crew built 250 homes west of downtown Dearborn to provide housing to his workers who worked at a factory 6 blocks away at the intersection of Oakwood Boulevard and Michigan Avenue, where they built tractors. That plant was opened in 1917. The plant also employed 4,000 workers total. Most of the workers lived in Detroit since housing was scarce in Dearborn at the time. Over the years, the neighborhood has been nicely preserved while keeping its historic feel, which gives it a nice charm. While we're looking at this, let's go over the economic stats for Dearborn, shall we? Here's the population history for Dearborn. You can see how in 1970 the population started to go down before trending back up around 2000. The downward trend in the later half of the 20th century was largely due to the loss of manufacturing jobs. Fortunately for Dearborn, Ford was able to reinvest in the community starting around 2000, but the recent growth has also been largely due to Middle Eastern immigrants, which we can get into that later. Today, 105,000 people live in Dearborn, which is 3,000 less than what was counted in 2020, or a decline of 3.8%. The median household income is $64,000, and nearly 35% of adults 25 and older hold a bachelor's degree or higher. The median value of owner-occupied housing units is $189,000, while the poverty rate is on the higher side at 23.7%. On to the crime rates now, and both the violent and property crime rates are below average, so that's all good and dandy. So according to the data, Dearborn across the board is a very safe city. Now, some of the areas in the eastern side of the city have an older look to them than the neighborhoods in West Dearborn do, and the eye test says that there's a little bit more money in West Dearborn, but that's just an income gap. It's not really a dangerous city anywhere within the city limits. Early on in the video, I showed you West Dearborn. Well, this is East Dearborn. This part of town has a stronger blue-collar feel to it. East Dearborn, though, has plenty of restaurants and shops to check out, just as West Dearborn does.
Great comic book place. Great local comic book shop. It's called Green Brain Comic. Amazing owners. They're great in the community. If you're a comic book person, that's a destination for people in Southeast Michigan as well.
That's just one of the many places that you can check out here in East Dearborn, but let's go ahead and talk about this. In 2023, Dearborn became the first Arab American majority city in the U.S., with 55% of the population being Arab American. Not to be confused with the nearby city of Hamtramck, which claims to be the first Muslim majority city. Well, Middle Eastern culture in Dearborn isn't a new thing. They first settled in Dearborn as early as 1917 to work for Ford. Of course, there were other immigrant groups around this time, such as Polish, German, Irish, and Scottish, but those immigrant groups could be seen all across all of the other major metropolitan areas in the country. Middle Easterners? Not so much. Detroit was one of the very few metropolitan areas in the country that saw a significant amount of Arab immigrants move in. There's an urban legend out there that Henry Ford once met a Yemeni sailor at a port and told him about the opportunity to work for him for $5 a day. The sailor then went back to Yemen and spread the word out to many across the Middle East. While that can't be confirmed, what can be confirmed is that Henry Ford was more accepting of Middle Easterners than he was of Jews and African Americans. That's right, Henry Ford didn't want to hire either of those ethnic groups, but he didn't have problems with Arab Americans. In fact, one of the first Arab American communities in Metro Detroit was in Highland Park, where Ford employed as many as 15,000 workers at its peak in the early 1900s. When Ford moved the headquarters to Dearborn and opened up the Rouge plant, the Arab Americans moved from Highland Park to the south side of Dearborn. Soon, as word got back across the world about the quality of life in America, specifically southeast Michigan, more and more waves of Middle Easterners moved to the area. Most of the immigrants ended up working for Ford, or they ended up working for one of the other major auto companies. By 1930, the majority of factory workers in Ford's assembly plants were of Middle Eastern descent. Of course, not all of the immigrants ended up working for Ford. Many of them ended up doing other forms of work such as managing grocery stores, gas stations, or restaurants. Even doctors moved overseas to help establish a strong Middle Eastern community. Even today, you can see signs printed in Arabic throughout Dearborn. Plus, when you factor in all of the wars and hardships that have gone on in many Middle Eastern countries over the decades, that only encouraged more people to want to migrate to America, specifically Detroit, as there was already an established community here. Many of the original settlers were from Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon. Even though the auto industry saw major job losses throughout the 70s and 80s, immigrants from the Middle East continued to populate not only Dearborn, but Metro Detroit as a whole. For example, several waves came in after U.S. immigration laws were relaxed in the 1960s. Some of the Arabs were Christian refugees, while others were Muslim. From 2000 to 2010, Michigan was the only state that lost population. It's often referred to as the lost decade. Detroit, of course, saw a larger amount of people move out during that decade than any other city in the country did. While all of that was happening, the Arab American population in Michigan continued to grow. Iraqi refugees made up for most of that growth during that era. In 2021, Abdullah Hamoud became the 7th mayor of Dearborn, and he became the first Arab American mayor for the city. So while Dearborn is the center for the Arab American community in Metro Detroit without a question, there's a lot more of them that live in other municipalities in southeast Michigan. Only California has a higher number of Arab Americans living in their state, but because California has over 30 million people living in their state, Michigan has a higher percentage of Arab Americans that represent the overall population, with most of them living in Metro Detroit, and of course, at least 55,000 of them live in Dearborn. Well, people, it is now that time. What did we learn in this video? We learned that you can't always trust a Google review, just like how you can't always trust someone who drinks too much Mountain Dew, but you can always trust Chris's livability score.
Education.
So I just showed you all three of Dearborn's high schools. Dearborn High serves the west side of the city, Fordson serves the east, while Edsel Ford serves the south. Dearborn High performs the best academically, while both Fordson and Edsel Ford perform slightly below average. Education gets an 11 out of 20.
Crime.
The crime rate is below average in Dearborn, so it's mostly a non-issue. That's easy. Crime gets a 16 out of 20.
Downtown.
What's impressive is that Dearborn has two walkable downtowns. They both look really similar too, so if you're not from the area and you're just visiting, it'll probably be hard for you to tell one from the other right away. Not only are both downtowns walkable, but you have free parking and plenty of shops and restaurants to check out. It gets an 18 out of 20.
Economy.
While the Ford Motor Company is headquartered in Dearborn and it's one of the more successful companies in the United States, the median household income in Dearborn is below the national average. The poverty rate is above 20%, and the median home value is below average as well. That tells me that most people who work for the good-paying jobs at Ford live elsewhere in Metro Detroit. It's not terrible though, because Dearborn still gets to collect corporate tax dollars from Ford, and I'm not saying that Dearborn is like some massively poverty-stricken community or anything. The poverty rate is just a little bit higher than average, so all in all, economy gets a 14 out of 20, and that sounds fair to me.
Recreation.
The recreation department here is second to none in this entire state. There's amazing softball leagues. We've got a really cool community center. They just redid all the tennis courts in town. There's 4 neighborhood pools in town, outdoor pools. Right, so that the recreation department and the recreation for town is awesome.
Look, it's not Dearborn's fault that they're not located right next to some massive ski resort or a beach with towering sand dunes. As Nick said, the city has done a good job with providing parks and recreational services to their residents. Plus, there's a pedestrian/bike path that starts in Dearborn and follows the Rouge River 20 or so miles northwest to the city of Northville, and I'm always a fan of those types of trails. Otherwise, a bunch of industrial pollutants to the southeast, and of course Dearborn is a very urban environment, so recreation gets an 8 out of 20.
History.
Henry Ford was born here, he grew up here, and he invented stuff here and changed not just American society, but society across the world. Plus, visiting the Henry Ford Museum complex is like living in history, so that gets a 20 out of 20.
Amenities.
That's another great thing about Dearborn is even if you don't want to hang out in town here, you can get into Detroit real quickly. You can get out to Ann Arbor really quickly. You shoot downriver really quickly.
Dearborn is not shy of having a variety of restaurant options. The city also has all of the big box stores that you would like, except for maybe a Costco, but you can live without that as long as you have mostly everything else. There's also a massive shopping center in Allen Park to the south, and of course downtown Detroit, like Nick said, is not that far away. Amenities gets an 18 out of 20.
Cost of living.
It depends on where you want to live in Dearborn. If you want some of the fancier homes and some of the fancier neighborhoods, or if you want to live close to the west downtown like the Like I said in the beginning, Dearborn is a big town. I drove around for 3 hours and I'll have a second video uploaded on my second channel showing you all of the footage that I filmed but didn't use in this video. The link for that will be down below once it's uploaded. Well, hey, I talked a lot about Henry Ford and how much he has meant for the growth of Dearborn and how he alone has contributed to a lot of the assets that the city is proud of having today, such as Greenfield Village. Well, let me ask you something. Have you ever heard of Flint, Michigan? General Motors didn't do the same for Flint as Ford has done for Dearborn over the years, and it's a stark difference between the two cities. For more on that, you can check out my video series on Flint right here. Peace.